The pen felt heavy, heavier than it should for a simple signature. It hovered over the line marked Petitioner. My hand trembled, just a fraction. Outside the lawyer's window, the city was a blur of indifferent lights, but in this room, under the cool, sterile glow, the air felt thick, suffocating. My chest ached, a dull, persistent throb that had settled in the moment I read the words. Divorce petition. His name, printed neatly. His signature, bold and deliberate. I had just finished wiring the final payment. The last dollar of the $15 million. His debt. Mine now in a way. Or rather gone. Vanished like smoke. He had looked so relieved when I told him. Beaming. He'd kissed my forehead, called me his savior. That was just 2 days ago. 2 days. And now this. The paper crinkled slightly under my fingertips. The smooth, expensive stock. Irony was a cruel mistress. He liked things expensive. Sharp suits, faster cars, sprawling houses. Things I'd helped provide. Things I'd worked for. Things my family had provided. Things I'd never once resented sharing. Not until now. My lawyer, Mr. Sterling, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with caution, cleared his throat. Are you ready, Mrs. Peterson? Mrs. Peterson. The name felt alien suddenly. A costume I was being forced to shed. I stared at the document again. The cold language of dissolution. Assets. Liabilities. Spousal support. It felt obscene. We weren't numbers on a page. We were or had been. The shock was a physical thing. It had hit me like a wave, knocking the wind out of me. I remember standing in the hallway, the envelope slick in my sweaty hand, the world tilting on its axis. The carefully constructed reality of my life, the one where we were building a future, where our love was the foundation, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. It wasn't just the divorce, it was the timing, the calculated cruelty of it. Letting me clear the mountain of debt, the thing that had been crushing him, that had stolen his sleep and put a haunted look in his eyes. Letting me bear that burden, lift it, and then, in the quiet aftermath, discarding me. It was a betrayal so profound, so breathtaking in its audacity, it stole the air from my lungs. It wasn't just an ending, it was an obliteration of everything I thought I knew about him, about us, about love itself. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, it helps me more than you know. Our life before the debt felt almost like a different lifetime. It was easy, comfortable. We met at a charity gala, one of those glittering, air-kissing events I usually dreaded but attended out of obligation. He was charming, effortlessly so. A quick wit, a disarming smile. He talked about his company, a tech firm on the rise, with a boyish enthusiasm that was infectious. I talked about my work, quietly managing investments and properties for my family's trust. We seemed to fit, like two pieces finding their place. There was a courtship that felt lifted from a romantic comedy. Dinners with friends, weekend getaways, late-night calls filled with laughter. He was attentive, supportive. He listened when I talked about my family, the weight of their expectations, the pressure of managing inherited wealth. He never seemed intimidated by it. He saw me, he said. The person, not the bank account. I believed him. God, I wanted to believe him. Marriage felt like the natural progression. A beautiful ceremony, surrounded by everyone we loved. Vows exchanged under a canopy of flowers, promising forever. The first few years were good. Peaceful. We bought a house, not ostentatious but elegant. We built routines. Shared breakfasts, evening walks, quiet nights in. He worked hard, often long hours, fueled by ambition. I supported his dreams, celebrated his successes. There were challenges, small ones, the usual disagreements that you navigate as a couple. Nothing that ever felt insurmountable. Nothing that chipped away at the foundation. The first hint of trouble wasn't a confession. It was a mood, a tension that coiled in his shoulders, a tightness around his eyes that sleep couldn't erase. He became withdrawn, prone to snapping at trivial things. The boyish enthusiasm was replaced by a weary cynicism. I asked him, gently at first, then with more insistence. Was it work? Was he okay? He'd brush it off. Stress. Just business pressure. Nothing for me to worry about. But I worried. How could I not? The man I loved was disappearing behind a wall of unspoken anxieties. I started noticing things. Late-night phone calls taken in hushed tones in the other room. Bills left unopened on the counter. A certain desperation in his attempts to court investors to land big deals. One evening, after a particularly tense week where he barely slept, he came home looking utterly defeated. He didn't even have the energy to fake a smile. He just sat at the kitchen table, head in his hands, the silence amplifying the sense of dread building inside me. I sat opposite him, reaching across the table to take his hand. It was cold, limp. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Please, talk to me." He finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and full of a shame that gutted me. "I'm in trouble," he said. The words hung heavy in the air. He started talking, the confession tumbling out in a torrent of choked sentences. Bad investments. Failed ventures. Promises made that couldn't be kept. A risky expansion that imploded. He'd borrowed, leveraged, taken out loans with predatory terms, convinced the next deal would save everything. It hadn't. The hole just got deeper. The interest piled up. And now, the creditors were circling. $15 million. A number so large it felt abstract. Unreal. A weight that could sink a ship. He was terrified. Terrified of losing everything. Terrified of the public humiliation. Terrified of failing me. I sat there, stunned into silence. $15 million. It was more money than I'd ever had to deal with personally at once. But I knew in the context of my family's resources, the trust, it was significant, yes, but not insurmountable. My family had built their fortune over generations, carefully, conservatively. The trust was vast, managed by a board of trustees who answered ultimately to me as the primary beneficiary, though navigating its protocols and accessing significant funds wasn't a simple matter of writing a check. It required justification, board approval, demonstrating a clear and responsible use of funds. He watched me, his eyes searching my face, bracing for anger, for disappointment, for judgment. But all I felt was a complicated mix of shock, fear for him, and protectiveness. This was the man I loved. My husband. He was hurting, cornered. My immediate instinct wasn't calculation or resentment. It was to help him, to pull him out of the abyss he'd dug for himself. "Okay," I said finally, the word quiet but firm. "Okay, we'll figure this out." He looked up, hope flickering in his eyes, quickly followed by skepticism. "How?" It's too much." "My family trust," I said. "It's complicated, but there are ways. It's not liquid cash I can just hand over, but we can structure something. A loan, or we need to talk to the trustees. Explain the situation. Show them it's a sound way to protect assets, to prevent a collapse that could have wider implications, even for the value of my interest in things if your public failure became intertwined." I was thinking on my feet, framing it in terms the trust would understand: risk mitigation, asset protection. It wasn't strictly true. My primary motivation was saving him, but appealing to the trust's pragmatic nature was the only path. His relief was palpable. He collapsed forward, burying his face in his hands, tears finally breaking through. He thanked me over and over. He swore he'd pay it back every cent. He swore he'd never hide anything from me again. He swore our marriage would be stronger for surviving this. Getting the trust to agree was a process. It involved lengthy meetings, presenting detailed financials, his, which were a mess, explaining the potential ripple effects of his company failing publicly. I had to advocate for him, lay bare his mistakes, but emphasize his potential, the jobs his company provided, the embarrassment a bankruptcy would bring. I essentially vouched for his character, his ability to recover, to learn from this catastrophic error. It felt like putting my own reputation on the line. My standing with the trustees, built on years of careful, responsible management of my own affairs and their smaller investments. It wasn't a bailout, not exactly. The trust structured it as a complex loan with strict terms, clear repayment schedules tied to the company's future profits, and a significant interest rate, albeit far better than the loan sharks he'd been dealing with. There were caveats, protections for the trust's assets, clauses that gave them oversight, quiet influence. It was intricate, designed to shield the trust while providing the necessary capital. It took months to finalize. Months of tense negotiations, of him living under a cloud of fear, of me feeling the weight of responsibility for both his future and the trust's assets. Throughout that time, he was a different person. Humbled. Open. He came to me with his worries, his plans. We felt like a team again, facing down a dragon together. He promised this was a new beginning. A second chance for his business, for us. When the final approval came through, when the funds were finally transferred and the creditors silenced, the relief in our home was immense. It was like a physical weight lifted. He was buoyant, full of energy again, talking about rebuilding, about how close he'd come to ruin and how I had saved him. He threw a small dinner party to celebrate just close friends. He raised a glass to me, his eyes shining. To my incredible wife, he'd said, his voice thick with emotion. Without her, I'd be lost. She saved my life, our life. Everyone had smiled, raising their own glasses. I'd smiled back, feeling a warmth spread through me. We had done it. We had faced the fire and come out the other side. The scar of the debt would always be there, a reminder, but it felt like a shared scar, one that would bind us closer. That was 2 days before the envelope arrived. Sitting in Mr. Sterling's office, staring at the petition, the memory of that toast felt like a cruel, elaborate joke. He'd called me his savior, toasted our life, all while planning to end it. The relief on his face hadn't been about escaping debt. It had been about escaping me. The moment the financial leash was gone, he cut the marital one too. The betrayal cut deeper than the financial loss. It was a violation of trust so absolute, it poisoned every memory, every shared moment. Had he ever loved me? Or had I just been a means to an end? A convenient lifeline? Mr. Sterling's voice was calm, measured. He talked about options, negotiation, mediation, litigation. It all sounded clinical, detached, like dismantling a machine, not tearing apart a life. I signed the paper. My hand was steady now. The tremor was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. The woman who had signed the papers to save him was gone. In her place was someone else. Someone who felt hollowed out but clear-eyed. Someone who understood, with a chilling certainty, that this wasn't just a divorce. It was a war. And he had fired the first shot, using my own ammunition. Early struggles were a blur of paperwork, legal consultations, and the bone-deep exhaustion that comes from emotional shock. Friends reached out, shocked, offering sympathy. I appreciated it, but their words felt distant, muffled by the ringing in my ears. How could he? Why? The questions circled endlessly in my mind, a vulture feasting on the carcass of my marriage. He communicated through his lawyer, a woman whose voice on the phone was clipped and devoid of warmth. His demands were aggressive. He wasn't just seeking a divorce. He was trying to minimize his financial obligations, potentially even argue that the $15 million debt payoff was a joint marital expense or a gift, not a loan for my family trust that needed repayment. The audacity of it was breathtaking. He was trying to use the very thing I'd done to save him as leverage against me. I felt a hot surge of anger, quickly followed by a cold, calculating calm. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about principle, about justice, about refusing to be a victim of such profound manipulation. Mr. Sterling advised caution. Divorce courts were unpredictable. Even with the clear documentation of the trust transaction, arguing it wasn't a marital asset or gift could be complex. He warned me that fighting this could be long, expensive, and emotionally draining. Sometimes, he said, his gaze steady, it's better to cut your losses. Cut my losses? The words grated. My losses weren't just financial. They were emotional, personal. The years invested, the love given, the trust shattered. Cutting my losses would feel like letting him get away with it. With all of it. The betrayal, the calculated cruelty, the attempt to twist my act of salvation into a weapon against me. I started digging. Not into his current finances. The lawyers were doing that. I started digging into how he'd gotten into that mess in the first place. The story he told me had been vague, a series of unfortunate business decisions. But the scale of the debt, the kind of people he'd been borrowing from, it hinted at something more. Something riskier, maybe even unethical. I hired a private investigator. Discreet. Expensive. His instructions were simple: find out everything about the $15 million debt. Where did it come from? Who were the creditors? What were the original deals that went bad? I wanted the truth, unvarnished. The investigator's reports came back slowly, in cryptic emails and carefully worded summaries. The picture they painted was darker than I'd imagined. It wasn't just bad business decisions. It was reckless gambling. Not on stocks or ventures, but on high-stakes, speculative deals that skirted the edges of legality. The creditors weren't banks. They were shadow entities, holding paper on deals he'd made in back rooms, deals that could ruin reputations if exposed. The $15 million wasn't just failed debt. It was hush money, penalty fees, the cost of getting out of obligations he couldn't meet without destroying himself. He hadn't just been financially incompetent. He had been involved in a world I knew nothing about, a world of risk and moral ambiguity. And he'd hidden it all, piling lie upon lie, until the whole structure threatened to collapse. And when it did, he hadn't confessed the full truth. He'd presented it as a noble failure, a businessman's bad luck, allowing me to see only the surface of his despair, eliciting my sympathy, my desire to save him. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My act of saving him hadn't just been financially exploited. It had been built on a foundation of fundamental lies about his character, his actions. He hadn't learned his lesson. He'd simply used my love, my resources, to clean up a mess he'd made in the shadows, a mess far dirtier than he'd ever admitted. This wasn't about divorce anymore. This wasn't even about the $15 million. This was about a deep, systemic dishonesty. It was about being married to a stranger, a man capable of profound deception, who saw people as tools to be used and discarded. The midpoint shift was complete. Hurt turned into cold fury. Sadness became a hard, brittle shell. I stopped seeing him as the man I had loved, who had simply lost his way. I saw him for who he truly was, a user, a manipulator, a man who would sacrifice anyone and anything to protect himself and his carefully constructed image. The battle intensified. His lawyer became more aggressive. They filed motions attempting to freeze certain assets, demanding extensive documentation, dragging the process out, clearly hoping to wear me down. There were veiled threats, suggestions that if I didn't agree to his terms, aspects of my life, my family's history, could become public fodder. He was escalating, fighting dirty. He seemed confident, secure in the knowledge that he had neutralized his biggest threat, the debt, and could now proceed with the divorce, leaving me bruised and financially diminished, while he walked away relatively clean, ready to rebuild his life and his company, debt-free thanks to me. He underestimated me. Profoundly. He saw my family's wealth, but he saw it as a distant, abstract thing. He saw my willingness to help, but he interpreted it as naivete, weakness. He didn't understand the trust. He didn't understand the power it wielded or the people who controlled it. He didn't understand that while I was its beneficiary, I was also its steward. And its protectors were fiercely loyal. I went back to the trustees. Not just Mr. Sterling. The core board members. Men and women who had known me since I was a child. Who had guided me, taught me about responsibility, about the weight of legacy. I laid it all out for them. Not just the divorce. The debt. The truth behind it, revealed by the investigator. His pattern of reckless behavior, his deception, his attempts to use the trust's funds, my act of saving him, against me in the divorce. Their reaction was swift, and unlike Mr. Sterling's cautious approach, absolute. The trust wasn't just a passive investment vehicle. It was a fortress built over generations to protect the family's legacy, their assets, and their reputation. My husband's actions weren't just a personal betrayal. They were a potential threat to the trust's integrity, a public embarrassment, a demonstration of how one could attempt to exploit its resources and then attack the family member associated with them. One of the senior trustees, a formidable woman named Eleanor Vance, looked at me, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "He has shown himself to be a man without honor," she said, her voice low and steady. "He has abused your trust and, by extension, he has shown contempt for the resources that were used to bail him out." Another trustee, an older gentleman named Mr. Abernathy, leaned forward. "He thinks he's clever, that he's untethered himself and can now start fresh, debt-free, keeping his business intact. He seems to believe," Eleanor continued, a steely glint in her eyes, "that the trust's involvement ended with the debt payoff, that it was a one-time transaction." This was the turning point. The discussions that followed weren't about the divorce settlement. They were about strategy, about a response that wasn't just defensive, but decisive. A response that wasn't about retrieving the $15 million loan, which the trust was confident it could legally reclaim, though the process would be drawn out, but about addressing the fundamental threat his continued operation, free and clear thanks to my intervention, represented. He was rebuilding his company, talking publicly about a financial restructuring and a new phase of growth. He was using the trust's funds, funneled through me, as the springboard for his renewed success, all while attempting to discard me and minimize his obligations. The plan they devised was audacious, bold. It leveraged the trust's immense resources, its complex structure, its ability to operate with a level of discretion and speed that was almost invisible until the final move was made. It wasn't about taking him down in court. It was about taking away the very thing he valued most, the thing he thought I had saved for him to keep: his company. Rising challenges involved absolute secrecy. The plan was put into motion with surgical precision. Layers of shell corporations, blind trusts, complex financial maneuvers designed to mask the ultimate buyer. The trust's network of contacts, its access to capital, its understanding of market dynamics, all were brought to bear. My role was minimal but crucial: maintain the facade. Continue with the divorce proceedings as planned. Let his lawyers think they were succeeding in wearing me down. Let him believe he was in control, that he held the power, that he was winning. Every negotiation, every filing, every terse communication through our lawyers was a performance, a distraction. It was agony. Pretending to be hurt, defensive, negotiating terms I had no intention of settling on. Listening to his lawyers make insulting offers, knowing what was coming, but having to maintain the poker face. There were moments I wanted to scream, to tell him exactly what was happening, to wipe the smug look off his face. But I held back. Secrecy was paramount. Any hint of the trust's movements, and he might find a way to protect himself, to hide assets, to complicate the acquisition. The months that followed were tense, nerve-wracking. While the divorce moved glacially through the system, the trust's gears were grinding silently, inexorably, towards their target. I received coded updates from Mr. Abernathy, brief, almost cryptic messages confirming progress. It felt surreal, leading this double life. Engaging in the mundane, soul-crushing work of divorce, while this financial leviathan moved beneath the surface, preparing to swallow his world whole. He, meanwhile, seemed to be thriving. His company announced new contracts, new hiring initiatives. He gave interviews, projecting an image of resilience and success. He was debt-free, thanks to the trust, and poised for growth. He thought he had outplayed me, that he had used my love, my resources, to escape ruin and was now free to build a new empire. He had no idea the ground was shifting beneath his feet. The day it happened was deliberately chosen. The board meeting, the one where he would present his company's rosy financial projections, detail his plans for expansion, celebrate his triumphant return from the brink. He was flying high. I wasn't there, not physically in his boardroom. My part was in the quiet observation, the waiting. I was in a conference room downtown with Mr. Sterling and Eleanor Vance. The air was thick with anticipation. The notification came as a series of rapid-fire alerts on Eleanor's tablet. Stock purchases. Large blocks. Unsolicited offers. The company's share price spiking. Then the news wires began to buzz. A hostile takeover bid. For his company. He would have been in the middle of his presentation, talking about his vision, about the future. And then his phone would start buzzing. Emails flooding in. Urgent calls from his board members, his CFO, his legal team. Panic would have set in quickly. Who was doing this? Where was the money coming from? Hostile takeovers are rare for companies his size, unless the buyer is massive, determined, and has deep, deep pockets. He would be scrambling, trying to identify the predator, to mount a defense. He wouldn't find any trace back to me, or to my family name. The trust had done its work flawlessly, anonymously. Then came the final blow. The official announcement. The press release. The buyer revealed. Not some anonymous corporation. Not a competitor. It was a holding company, a subsidiary, one of many structures the trust owned. But the press release made it clear who was ultimately behind the acquisition. It mentioned the family trust. My family trust. My trust. The one that had paid his debt. The one whose resources he had accepted, used, and then attempted to exploit. I imagined the moment he read it. Sitting at the head of his boardroom table, surrounded by his executives, his face flushed with panic from the initial alerts. Reading the name. Seeing my name, or at least the entity inexorably linked to mine. The blood draining from his face. The realization dawning, slow and horrifying. He hadn't just been saved by my family's wealth. He had become beholden to it. And now it wasn't just asking for its loan back. It was taking everything. The company he had built, the one he was so proud of, the one he thought he had protected by cutting me loose, it was gone. Swallowed whole. The plot twist wasn't just karma. It was a trap he had walked into, blindfolded, the moment he decided to take the trust's money and then betray the person who had facilitated it. He thought he was gaining freedom. Instead, he was signing away his independence, his control, his entire professional future. The climax was silent in our conference room. We watched the news unfold online. The frantic reports, the speculation. His company's stock soaring, then halted. The official statement. The confirmation. Eleanor gave a curt nod. It is done. Mr. Sterling, who had been skeptical but followed my instructions, looked amazed. Or maybe just stunned into silence by the sheer scale of the move. I felt nothing. A strange, hollow calm.
No triumphant joy.
No cathartic release. Just a quiet certainty. The debt was paid. Not just the money. The debt of his betrayal. He had tried to take everything. And he had lost everything. The aftermath was swift and brutal for him. He was, of course, immediately removed from his position as CEO. The trust, now the owner, installed its own management team. His carefully laid plans for expansion evaporated. His public image, the resilient comeback kid, crumbled overnight. He wasn't just divorced. He was professionally obliterated, his company absorbed into a vast, indifferent entity. The divorce, strangely, became simpler. With his primary asset gone, the landscape changed entirely. His attempts to fight over assets, to minimize his obligations, became almost comical in their futility. He had nothing left to leverage. The trust, through its legal channels, pursued the recovery of its $15 million loan, now with the added leverage of owning his former company's assets. His personal fortune, never as substantial as he liked people to think, was quickly depleted by legal fees and the inevitable fallout. I never spoke to him directly again. He tried to call, to rage, to plead. I never answered. His lawyer sent increasingly desperate messages, shifting from aggression to appeals for negotiation, for mercy. There was no mercy to give. He hadn't shown me any when he filed for divorce 2 days after I saved him. I heard things, of course, through mutual acquaintances who quickly distanced themselves from him. He was scrambling, trying to find new footing. his reputation was in tatters. The story, when it leaked, and the trust was careful about how it leaked, emphasizing the reckless debt and the trust's need to protect its investment, was one of a man who had run his company into the ground, was bailed out by his wife's family, and then, in a final act of hubris, lost control entirely. The divorce became a footnote. I emerged from the wreckage quieter, perhaps, but fundamentally changed. The trust's acquisition wasn't about revenge, not entirely. It was about protection. Protection of my family's legacy, yes, but also protection of myself. By taking away his platform, his power base, the trust ensured he couldn't repeat his pattern of behavior, couldn't use and discard others the way he had used me. There was no grand victory celebration. The trustees were pragmatic. It was a business transaction, albeit one with significant personal implications. They had protected the trust's assets and demonstrated, unequivocally, that attempting to manipulate the family came at a cost. For me, the emotional closure came not from seeing him suffer, though there was a cold satisfaction in that, but from reclaiming my own narrative. I wasn't the naive wife who was taken advantage of. I was the woman who had, perhaps foolishly, loved a flawed man, tried to save him, was betrayed, and then, with the quiet, formidable power of her lineage, ensured that justice, of a sort, was served. The house we shared felt empty at first. Too large, too full of ghosts. I changed things. Repainted walls, moved furniture, cleared out his things. Slowly, painstakingly, I made it mine again. A space free of his lies, his debts, his betrayals. The $15 million loan from the trust? It was eventually restructured, folded back into the trust's operations in a way that minimized the financial impact. The company he built, now under the trust's ownership, continued to operate, employing people, generating revenue that now benefited the trust and ultimately me. It was a strange twist, profiting from the remnants of his ambition, but it felt right. A tangible return on a painful investment. I learned a harsh lesson about trust, about the difference between love and calculation, about how deeply people can hide their true selves. But I also learned about resilience, about the quiet strength of old money, old power, and the people who understand how to wield it. The scars remained. The cynicism was a new companion. But beneath it, a different kind of strength had formed. Harder, wiser. I had faced a profound betrayal and emerged not just intact, but owning the field. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear your version. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Thanks for being here. Subscribing helps bring more of these to life.